So there's been much talk in recent years about killer robots. Much of it has been breathless and speculative, but this seemed a particularly good moment to take stock of current real-world developments. So on the one hand, the technology underpinning autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems is growing by leaps and bounds and is quite literally changing the nature of warfare, most dramatically in Ukraine, but elsewhere as well. At the same time, with global governance increasingly in crisis, the challenge of ensuring the responsible use of AI, and I put the word responsible in scare quotes because I'm still not entirely sure what that means, in military applications is considerable and not helped by the resistance on the part of powerful military actors against any regulation in this field. So today we brought together what I think is fair to say is a distinguished panel of experts to discuss these issues. We've asked them both to assess the prospects for and the obstacles to meaningful governance in this area and to reflect on current practice as it is evolving in Ukraine and elsewhere. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. I won't go through their full bios because they were on the advertisement. But let me start with Branka Marian, who is seated to my right, who is a senior researcher at Project Plowshares here in Waterloo, where she leads the research on the military and security implications of emerging technologies. Most important for our purposes here is that Branka is a graduate of the PhD program in global governance at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and she's still here. We can't strike her. Second, we have Alexander Blanchard, who is a senior researcher in the Governance of Artificial Intelligence program at SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, for those who didn't catch the acronym. Alexander's work focuses on issues related to the development, use, and control of military applications of artificial intelligence. And last but not least, Elke Schwartz is a professor of political theory at Queen Mary University in London, joining us online as with Alexander. Her work focuses on the nexus of ethics, technology, and politics/warfare, with a specific emphasis on new and emerging military technologies. So we have until about 1:30 today, which is close to an hour and a half. I'd like to propose that each of our speakers provide some introductory comments for approximately 15 minutes. I think we'll start with Alex, followed by Elke, and then Branka. And then we'll have a significant amount of time for discussion to follow. So with that, Alexander, if you are ready, I will hand over the microphone to you.
Elke and Branka, it's a really interesting time to talk about the prospects and obstacles. And when I was thinking about the kind of the brief you gave us for this panel, I was struck by, I think the obstacles potentially outweigh the prospects, and there's a lot of but there is some hope, and there's a lot of ways of coming at it. What I thought I would do is just focus on the sort of stuff we do at SIPRI. So what we do at SIPRI is we take kind of academic research and try and package it up for the policy audience to try and kind of give them an evidence base for their kind of conversations around these matters. So we've been involved in the conversations on autonomous weapon systems for a while, and kind of latterly the stuff on military applications of AI. So to try and preempt how the other panelists might approach the question, what I'm going to try and do today is just focus on the kind of interactions we've been having at SIPRI with the policymakers, with the diplomats, with the people in the ministries. And I'm just going to try and get some reflections on what I'm getting from that angle. So to an extent, the things I'm about to say are somewhat anecdotal, but I hope that's okay. In going first, I thought, maybe it's worth giving a bit of context to where we're at the moment. And as you say, for a long time now, the conversation on artificial intelligence in the military domain has been dominated by autonomous weapon systems. They have been on the sort of disarmament calendar in Geneva for about 10 years now. The states started talking about them in 2014, and then they started the formal group of government experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems in 2016. Um, but there's a kind of a growing recognition, I think, at the moment. I mean, it's something that, most people have known for a long time, but something policymakers are grasping is that AI is actually quite a multifaceted issue. And it goes much more beyond autonomous weapon systems. And I think the realization came, or the penny dropped, I think, firstly with the kind of astronomical rise of generative AI, and this kind of kicked off a global policy debate. But specifically in with regards to military matters, I think it was Israel's use of gospel and lavender, the decision support systems in Gaza, and also sort of Ukraine-Russia war. In terms of governance, as I said, it's largely been dominated by the GG on laws. That's the group of government experts on laws since 2014, and then in 2023, South Korea and the Netherlands kicked off the Responsible AI in the Military Domain process. So that's REAIM for short. There's a lot of acronyms in this space. And then that went on to 2024 and 2026. And then in 2024, you had the first, and the point of the re-aim conferences was to look more broadly at AI. But then in 2024, you had your first resolution at the General Assembly on AI in the military domain and what it meant for peace and security. Then the Secretary General released his report in 2025 on AI in the military domain. And then in May, states will begin their informal consultations on military AI and its peace and security implications in Geneva. So I think, oh, and at the end of this year, we have the vote in Geneva on autonomous weapon systems about whether states will continue their current negotiations as they are, or they're doing it in some different way, or if they'll drop them. So I think on the face of it, it looks like things are kind of hotting up in terms of the governance of these technologies, and prospects are good. I think outwardly, though, what you may see kind of belies what is internally a lot of inertia. So I think a lot of the kind of stuff that's happened at the General Assembly, for instance, and what is continuing to happen in Geneva is just the sense that states feel like something has to be said, well, a lot of states, not all, something has to be said on these things, but they're not exactly sure what it is. And so there's an attempt to just kind of keep the conversation going, particularly on at the General Assembly, I think without really a sense of the goals which are to be had by taking it to that forum. I think there's some sense in which we're also kind of going backwards. So for the REAIM initiative, the 2023 and the 2024 meetings, the outcome documents were endorsed by 60 states each time. And the REAIM that happened in February this year that's just passed, only 35 states endorsed the outcome document. So it's basically halved. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. Firstly, I think the conference was Spain made a bit of a hash of organizing the conference. I don't think that entirely explains it. I think states are also quite wary of normative change outside of the United Nations. But I think what was clear from that meeting, and Elko and Ranko were there, so they can also chip in on this as well, is that in conversation with diplomats and policymakers, there's no sense of a clear mission in them being there. There was a kind of a lack of understanding of some of the language that was in the final outcome document from that conference. And yeah, there was just an all-round sense that states don't exactly know what they want to do with this topic or what they want from it. It was kind of like it was the feeling of everybody had a cigarette, but no one had a lighter, that kind of feeling. So I think that's one obstacle, which is I just don't think states know what their position is on AI yet. I think a second obstacle is and this relates to the first, is that maybe they lack the vocabulary to understand or to make sense of what they want for governance processes on these technologies. And I think one of the upshots of the dominance of the autonomous weapon systems in this debate is that Geneva, Geneva has provided the center of gravity for discussions on AI for a while, for military AI. And since that has been under the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, it has meant that it's been primarily a discussion of international humanitarian law, but also a kind of a subset of international humanitarian law, targeting law. So states have gotten used to talking about kind of AI issues, specifically a legal issue, but a very sort of specific part of law. In fact, I think it would be a little bit unfair to say that the last 10 years in Geneva have basically been a kind of prolonged exegesis on law, and what IHL means. And the overflow of that, the upshot is that when states talk about these things, they're using quite a sparse vocabulary, I think, to discuss these issues. And hopefully that will change because we now know a lot about kind of what goes into building these technologies, and we know how the data is collected, and we know these kind of problematic practices and how they're used. And so hopefully moving forward, there'll be space for kind of human rights issues to come in. But yeah, that will mean moving beyond that kind of vocabulary that's been developed in Geneva. I think the third point I wanted to make is about both an obstacle and a priority. Sorry, not a priority, an obstacle and a prospect, which is about the kind of position of the USA in these debates. I think up until now, well, up until very recently, you could say the USA's role in this has been kind of equivocal. I think with respect to military applications of AI generally, they've been kind of constructive. So at the first of the aim, they launched what they called their political declaration on responsible AI, and they set up schemes and programs for knowledge sharing and capacity building and confidence building. They were they were kind of constructive in Geneva on autonomous weapon systems, but more or less kind of obstructing progress, I think, in that fora. Um, but yeah, any kind of goodwill has just gone out the window with Trump's second term. So they've totally disengaged from anything that has the title responsible in it. Um, and I think the kind of debate that's going on at the moment with Anthropic shows that the Department of War is it's not willing to accept any limitations being imposed on what it sees as its rightful use of these technologies. Um, but I don't think that's an obstacle. I think that's a prospect because it just opens space for states to kind of reconsider how they're addressing these issues. Because I think, particularly in the discussion of autonomous weapon systems, states have been very kind of wary of doing anything that would mean they lost the USA on this. That they've been very keen to, well, not all states, a kind of subsection of states, a lot of the European states, for instance, middle ranking states as they're called, I guess, have been very keen to keep the USA on side and make sure they continue to be part of the discussions, and that the USA can sign on to anything that comes out of the stuff in Geneva on autonomous weapon systems. I mean, I don't know how rational this position is, given the USA's kind of historic position on, signing up to any legally binding treaties. If you think about additional protocols one and two to the 1977 Geneva Conventions. But in any sense, the fact that the USA stepped back perhaps may allow an opportunity for different states to step forward, offer some sort of leadership in this area. And it may just kind of slightly change the strategic calculus around what states want. But the question is what state will step forward and kind of show leadership in that respect. Austria has been driving a lot of the kind of push to move autonomous weapon systems to the General Assembly. But I think there's some kind of wariness around other states about the fact that Austria is not a NATO member. There's some kind of feelings about the TPNW on, ending nuclear weapons, and there's a bit of a kind of a hangover from that. So yeah, so the USA stepping back it's an obstacle and a prospect, but the question is what state is going to kind of step in, or which group of states is going to step in and show leadership in that regard. So yeah, that kind of concludes my reflections, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists and moving into the
So
discussion.
much. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to talk artificial intelligence in the military domain. It has been such a whirlwind the last couple of weeks with AI being really at the forefront of media coverage in many ways for a number of reasons. So yeah, what better time than now to think a little bit more about what is urgently required for useful, effective, meaningful governance of military artificial intelligence. I want to start by saying, of course, this AI is not just one thing. There are many ways in which various AI systems can be used in the military domain. There's a lot of stuff that is completely, or not completely, but less controversial, for back office stuff, or the use of artificial intelligence for logistics or transport or predictive maintenance or anything that is related to objects, not humans or human contexts. And I think the strength of artificial intelligence should be explored and is quite easy to see and has fewer ethical challenges attached to it. But we are, of course, talking primarily about those systems that we seem to be seeing in use at the moment, that we have seen in use with Gaza or in Gaza, in Iran now. And those are the kind of the AI decision support systems. And for me, in the decades worth of work that I've done, or thinking that I've done on autonomous weapon systems, for me this was always the AI component as a part of the decision framework towards making a lethal decision has always been kind of very prominent. And I think for me the crux was always there. How do we deal with the system that takes on a cognitive facet of what should be human judgment in making a lethal decision? So it's the AI decision support systems and AI systems used to kind of make sense of human contexts and sort of act on them. Those are the types of AI models or AI environments of uses that are most challenging, ethically speaking, but also, of course, legally speaking. So in addition to what Alex has already said, states, civil society have been thinking about this in the context of autonomous weapon systems for a while, but also in the context of AI. I mean, I remember the US was the first to kind of come up with a whole set of AI ethics principles for the defense environment, which was drafted in 2019, I think, and it resulted in a document of 5 principles that was adopted by the US Department of Defense back in 2020. Governable, reliable, traceable, equitable, governable, and so on and so forth. And the UK had followed suit at the same time, or actually a couple of years later, and came up with its own set of principles, also 5, which kind of map onto the US principles as well. Human-centric, responsible, understandable. So very similar kind of ideas. But I think over the course of the years since then, the focus has very much been on the technological control, or the control over the technology. And what seems to have crystallized is like, we have to make sure that these technologies are reliable. That's the bottom line. It's also probably the one that is most feasible to do, because all the other ones, how do you make a system human-centric? What does that even mean? How do you make a system equitable? What does that even mean? What is the meat? What is the substance to this principle? And that is very much undecided. And in some ways, I think that is why we find ourselves in a slightly drifty kind of environment when it comes to AI governance at the moment. Of course, this was then taken up by REAIM and the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the military domain. And there we also have some guiding principles which have a little bit more substance, from shared ethical principles and foregrounding human life and peace. These are great aspirations to the technical component, which is life cycle responsibility somehow built in, to the key question of institutional support, but also safeguarding human agency. But these still remain really challenging aspirations rather than, okay, this is what we're going to do. But of course, every governance system starts somewhere from, like, what do we want? So these are really, really important things. But of course, we find ourselves in an environment right now also where we are seeing the increased rollout and use of AI-enabled decision support systems, targeting systems in live conflicts, despite the very well-known many, many risks, inefficiencies, problems with data, they present. And so increasingly, we are definitely getting the sense that all of these speculative benefits that have been circulated in the space by the proponents, that AI systems can be more discriminatory and more humane, or more support more restraint. All of those things don't seem to bear out. Quite the contrary. The way often these lauded potential benefits of new AI systems for decision support don't necessarily protect civilians and civilian objects, but rather it seems that violence is surging, and that civilians are dying at a staggering rate. Global tensions are growing; they're not diminishing. And so, for me, rather than looking at how do we control this technology, I think it's really important that we kind of look at the broader contours of what we do with this technology, right? This is not a deterministic kind of account or a suggestion that AI makes us do X, Y, Z, but rather I'm interested in this co-constitutive kind of relationship that we have, and by which a certain AI shapes a certain way of seeing things, and that in turn shapes a certain way of maybe adjusting to violence, justifying violence, or normalizing violence in a way. So I'm really interested in that. And with that in mind, I have some, challenges that I've written about this last year, but I kind of want to highlight, which in my books make it really difficult to find to move forward with what we call responsible AI. It's possible that we can't make responsible AI when it comes to the use of AI systems for targeting. It might very well be possible that that's always irresponsible. But there are certain things that I think make it really challenging. Certain tensions there between what the technology is and what we want from it, and where we see ourselves and our own role in this configuration. So one of the reasons that I think is important to keep in mind is that, unlike a legacy system of sorts, artificial intelligence is a different type of technology. It has a certain impermanence to it. It's not really a finished kind of technology. And even if you have a system, then there's always implicit mandates and requirements for updates. It works with dynamic data in some ways. So the underlying logic is iterative in that sense. And just like any other software system in the commercial realm, AI systems will need to be updated. They need to stay relevant. They need the correct amount of data. And so safeguarding that, or making sure that that works, and that works in tandem with other systems, which may have a different schedule of updates or various other requirements. That's something that I see as quite thorny. But also the mandate that the AI industry sort of brings along with it, and we've seen this with this extremely rapid rollout of large language models, there are more new types of techniques and products coming onto the market, and they all kind of want to be used, right? So it was some kind of AI system, computer recognition, fine. Then we have large language models with the introduction of the transformer architecture. Now we're moving towards AI agents, and everybody wants to just roll out some products whereby AI agents now enter the picture, including in the defense domain. But with every new model of AI, of course, new problems emerge. And so new challenges and problems that require ethical considerations will then emerge, not just from the new iterations and subsequent implementation of AI, but also from the new types of products that want to be used in that kind of space. And I think that poses a significant challenge in a way that other weapons or weapon systems don't pose or haven't posed in the past. So it kind of will leave governance, let alone the concept of responsibility, kind of always on the back foot and at the mercy of those with the interest of introducing ever more AI into all proceedings. So that's one challenge that I see. The second reason I think governance is very difficult at the moment is that we kind of overestimate our own ability to control what the perspective which AI provides, and to what degree we can interfere with that. And it relates to the first point. So we're not necessarily we consider AI as just another tool in the toolbox without really taking into account its necessarily expansive nature and also our own reactivity to a technology that takes decision-making tasks on in a way that mirrors our own and to which we have very little defenses than to anthropomorphize. There's something to be said about an expansionist nature of this particular technology, creating a kind of like an environment in which, in order for this technology to function really, really well, everything has to be enrolled into the AI data universe, right? So the more data compliant environments you have, the better the system can function. So everything is then likely to be drawn into the wake of AI systems and systems of systems. It's not just one AI system. So that all human affairs then will ultimately bend to the AI logic is my worry. And the more, of course, intricately humans are embedded within AI systems and systems of systems, the more likely it is that the system's logic then determines the practical course of action, right? So the old adage of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail still applies. That still applies. Once a system is sufficiently ubiquitous in any context, very often the question will likely shift from, well, should I use the system, to how can I use the system here? There's also something to be said about problem orphaning, by which you start with a problem, then you look at it through the lens of AI. The AI system can only address a partial aspect of the problem, which then becomes the new problem, but the original problem then is left orphaned. So that's the second problem. And the last one, and I'll be fast. It's the third reason for me, and by most a significant and problematic reason at the moment, is that the industry that stands to gain the most from the current military AI bonanza seems to thrive on limiting regulation and completely eschewing oversight practices and traditions. And in fact, at times actively promoting what might be called unethical viewpoints that wantonly call for violence in some ways, for lack of a better expression. So this has to do, and I've written about this, with the venture capital environment, which relies on speed and scale, and which needs startups to scale fast for extraordinary valuations, from which then investors can capitalize, or on which investors can capitalize. And which produces a different kind of mandate for speed and scale within the defense environment that is potentially problematic. It also potentially produces a dynamic by which, in order to grow really, really fast, startups need to test out their weapons, and in order to test out their weapons, they need live conflicts, and that, of course, produces an environment which is marked by instability and large-scale potential of harm. So, the relationship between the mandate for growth and return on investment and the benefit of a conflict for that purpose, that has to be examined in some ways. But it also has to do with the very loud and vocal voices. They're the minority in terms of the bigger military industrial technology complex, but they are very loud voices coming from the technology investment sector, coming from the new startup defense tech sector, which really lean in extremely heavily against any kind of regulation. And I think that's exactly what we saw play out in the Anthropic Pentagon spat. Not that Anthropic is this ethical actor and the Pentagon is the villain. There is no good actor here. It's not up to Anthropic or the Pentagon to set these standards. And yet, by producing such a spectacle, such a theater play onto which everybody latched onto, all media outlets, the ethical guidelines or guardrails are lowered to such minimal standards, right? So the mass surveillance of Americans and fully autonomous weapon systems, that's now all of a sudden the red line. That's not enough. It should be much more robust. This needs to be a multilateral international effort, and the restraints need to be set much higher. But it is a kind of a dance that the technology industry does, which holds a lot of power, together in unison with the Pentagon, and the Department of War is very much informed by a venture capital technology sector logic of speed and scale. So if you look at the new policies, the idea of speed and scale or speed and volume always emerge. So that kind of industry perspective makes it really difficult. So these are all the disastrous things why we can't have nice regulation. But I think there's hope. I do think we really need to retrain our lens. We need to refocus the lens onto the consequences of these kinds of systems. At this point, we have more empirical evidence that more strikes will yield more harm, right? 1,300 civilian deaths in the last 2 weeks. That's not nothing. That is important. That is terrible. That is awful. The realities of warfare are shocking. 3 million displaced people, horrible. So rather than focusing on what is AI doing here, I think it's really important to see what has been happening since we have cultivated this AI landscape in which lethality has been foregrounded. Implicitly and explicitly. And with that in mind, we can think about the ethos of what we want here and perhaps become much more restrictive in what is allowed and what is disallowed for the time being. There's more to say, but of course, we don't have all day, and I want to leave some space for Branka as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be back here. I feel like I am a fixture at the Balsillie School. Somebody's going to have to, change a light bulb or two here. I'm aging. And I'm especially grateful that Elke and Alexander could join us. This is a small community of researchers, and I think you will find the people, especially Elke and Alex and others, are just wonderful individuals who do a lot of great work. And I think it's such a great sort of pleasure to have them with us. I would say I started focusing on this issue after my graduation from the Balsillie School in 2015. And I will say the first generation sort of issue of this was the lethal autonomous weapons debate. That's what I became interested in at the UN level to understand, because I'd seen how hard it was to put societies back together once they're broken. I wanted to understand, like, how do we prevent that from happening? And this issue in particular, the speed and scale that Elke was talking about, I think something that some of us realized very early on is going to be really challenging for the global community to handle. So if you compare, for example, the first 24 hours of Operation, Epic Fury, there's always some crazy name for these, but the attack on Iran, it's 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours. When Israel used these AI decision support tools that Elke is talking about and Alexander talked about as well, in operations in Gaza, it went from having like 100 targets a year to 100 targets a day. So what we're talking about is an incredible scaling up of potential harm. So even if, you can say, okay, there's some accuracy there, the scale of harm sort of starts to negate whatever you're getting in terms of the actual accuracy. And then, of course, I think what we've seen is an incredible level of civilian harm, which is in the early days and discussions of lethal autonomous weapons, what we were told that the promise of these systems was the civilian lives will be protected. This was going to protect civilians. And of course, some of us really were concerned about that because the trajectory of a lot of warfare over the last few decades has been that civilians actually are suffering more and more, and we're backsliding on civilian protections, particularly through these arms control mechanisms, which are falling apart essentially at the international level. So without that infrastructure to protect civilians, I think what's become really challenging for us is to understand what types of governance responses are necessary. Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, so I'll quote the great Northern Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But we have to. This is the sort of the challenge, this Gordian knot that we're in. We all understand the limitations to this language of responsible military AI and governance. We understand the limitations to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the UN as a fora. for these discussions, the slow moving pace of this. I mean, we've had over a decade, and Alexander has a great paper talking about, you know, how there has been a great deal of nuance actually that's been developed among states, but that doesn't necessarily make it into that main room and that main discussion. So we have built expertise, which I think is really critical for us to take on. So fully acknowledging that I think this is an incredibly challenging topic to have regulation on. I do think there are a few things that we should be focusing on just from a very practical perspective in order to try and, you know, tame the dogs of war. If that's sort of the, you know, if you remember the old article on, you know, what is arms control? Is it just taming the dogs of war? If we're trying to do that, like, what are the things that we could do? Fully understanding that I think there are these broader challenges that some of that regulation or some of those international efforts won't, you know, it won't meet fully all of the challenges that this technology is bringing to us. And I'm speaking at the owl because if I don't speak at the owl, this is the beauty of technology. People online don't hear as well, so I'm sorry to the room. I'm not ignoring you, but I know this from human machine interaction before. So, you know, what are sort of the things I'm always thinking about this from a very practical sort of governance perspective. Like, what are the layers of governance that are needed in order to respond? So Elke and Alexander both nicely outlined the fact that militaries are using AI across a range of functions, right? And a part of this sort of algorithmic warfare that has emerged actually, you know, it's not a new phenomenon. Probably since 9/11, the United States became really interested in addressing the fact that they had a lot of data that they were gathering across a variety of sources, so video feeds and you know, human intelligence and various sort of data points that were coming in. And basically the United States was really interested in a system that could sift through that data, analyze it much more quickly than a human analyst could, but also integrating different inputs, right? Different data sources. And that's where Project Maven probably becomes sort of a pivotal moment for what we need to address, which is in 2017. This sort of project becomes better known, and Google sort of implicated because Google's brought on board to provide essentially the expertise to improve object recognition, right? Like to improve object recognition of the video feeds that the drones are collecting, right? And it's a clear recognition of where do the resources and talent on these technologies lie, which is what Elke is talking about, which is, you know, it is the commercial sector. It is industry that has a lot of the resources, the know-how about this technology, and that is propelling this military use as well at the current moment. But as Elke rightly points out, what happens is interesting, where these technological, you know, these experts and these tech companies are telling the military, like, we're the experts, you're not the experts in war, which is a really interesting, I think, position to be in. But just to go back to that point with Project Maven, what happens, you know, there's backlash from Google employees, and they say, well, these we work for, you know, a tech company. This is not a defense company. And what we're seeing now is that blurring of the lines. Like all the major, major US companies, all the major US tech companies are essentially in the business of war because of the infrastructure that they're providing to the US military and to other militaries as well, allied militaries. So what we're really faced is understanding, like, who are all the stakeholders and what the Pentagon and the Anthropic sort of spat, if you want to call it that, brings out is that, you know, there's a really great article by a professor in George Washington University talking about how we're doing regulation by contract. These are all these ad hoc measures. In that discussion among the Pentagon and Anthropic, like, where is Congress? You know, where's US Congress? Where is there sort of a regulatory response? And what it just starts to unveil is the fact that there isn't actually regulatory responses that exist in place, but the technology is being used in real time and in conflict zones. And Elke pointed to the civilian deaths, the strikes on, you know, a school in Iran, 160 something children that are killed. These are children. I think that's really important for us to again, humanize, because what the technology does is it dehumanizes people. So you say, well, you have 1,000 targets, but when you say you have 1,000 humans or 1,000, civilian objects, or even if they're military objects, we have to be more specific and precise in our language about the impact of these systems. So what are sort of the three things that I'd love for a regulatory discussion to be much more focused on? One is the life cycle of weapon systems. And Morgan's here, and Morgan and I with CG participated in an exercise at the RIEM in Spain, where we looked at the different stages of a life cycle of a weapon. So from research development all the way to decommissioning of systems, which is also incredibly important. What we quickly realized is that it was hard sometimes to assign responsibility and accountability. And in some languages, responsibility and accountability are not necessarily distinct categories. So we have a real challenge of ensuring that human control, however we want to term it, is maintained so that there are individuals who are accountable throughout that life cycle. And we need to take all those technological considerations in place, like Alexander Alke both said. These are not perfect technologies. I've been trying to say this for years. There's no magic solution to the issues that AI has in general that are somehow solved in the military context. It's not like, okay, there's some military grade AI. I think people sometimes ask me, is there military grade AI? I'm like, no, it's the AI that but it's maybe been trained on, confidential sources or systems, but it has all of the same issues that ChatGPT probably has with you. It hallucinates, it makes you feel really confident, and, tells you can change the world. All of those problems are still inherent in that technology. So we need to really think about the technology, how it's built. Do the people who are using it understand it? Where's the data coming from? And I think that's what Alf is pointing to. You need to have this massive level of surveillance of societies, right? That I don't think we want to subscribe to. I don't think anyone has consented to that level of surveillance. So we need to be very thoughtful about that. We've all talked about AI decision support systems in the military domain. I think these are very, very deserving of attention. This is what was used in Gaza, but also something that was used in Gaza in 2021 and received a lot less attention at that time. But 2021 is probably one of the first uses of some of these recommendation systems. And what's so important there is that human-machine interaction, because what we're seeing is that these systems are impacting our agency when we're making decisions. They're impacting the level of control that we're exercising, and the quality of our decision-making, because we're so, impacted by what's being recommended to us. And in time-compressed environments, right, when you have to make targeting decisions, or you have to make decisions very rapidly, all the issues of automation bias, we overtrust systems, right? We tend to trust machines and so-called machines, but we tend to trust this technology more than we should. And there, I want to say too, one of the issues that's emerging, people are saying, well, maybe we don't need to talk about autonomous weapons. We just need to talk about AI decision support systems. And take it from me, just from having dedicated over a decade of my life to this now, I don't think that that's actually accurate. I think the reality is that the AI decision support systems are impacting levels of autonomy in weapon systems. And that's because when most people think about autonomous weapons, they think about these crazy robots, and they don't think about small drones, the existing platforms, right? Levels of autonomy in weapon systems are going to be impacted by what's happening with the AI decision support systems. And finally, and I'll end here so we can have a nice conversation, is we really need to consider issues of trust and transparency. And this is where the multilateral framework needs to do all of the boring but crucial sort of architecture development, whether it's crisis communication mechanism, opportunities for de-escalation and standards. I think it's really worrying that we have had over a decade of discussions at the CCW on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and we don't have a crisis communication solution. We don't have a sense of who you call if you're testing some system and something goes wrong. we didn't, we don't have that basic sort of level of confidence building. And some of it goes back to what Alexander is saying, we need to have a shared language. And even around language, though we have a lot of excellent work and expertise, it does need to be put in a document or something that states can talk to each other about, because at times they're using language in different ways, often, of course, to serve their particular interests. But I think, we need to be very clear about that. When we're talking about human control, we have to say it's not some unprecedented level of human control. What we're asking for are, can you have the existing levels of human control that ensure that there's accountability, that ensure that someone can be held reliable? And so this is really important to do among allies. Middle powers are really good talking to each other and like-minded states, but we also need to do it with more adversarial states. And that's where, that's really what diplomacy is there for. And we've been struggling with that. And so I'll end there, but I think we really have to work on that broader trust, because if there is this level of distrust and the current geopolitical situation continues, we will see systems used and fielded which are not ready for these contexts. And that will have enormous humanitarian consequences that will be on us to clean up, right? It's not going to be the tech companies that deal with massive refugee flows. It's not going to be the tech companies that respond to societies that have been destroyed, right? It's going to be humanitarians, and it's going to be the so-called international community. So I think there's so much that needs to be done, acknowledging that our responses will be imperfect. But I think that looking for perfection is not what we need to do here.
Great, thank you, Branka. Thank you, all three of you. I think a lot of us who are not experts in this field are still kind of stuck in this killer robot debate, and it was helpful to listen to all three of you and kind of get a sense of the scope and the rapidity with which things are evolving in all sorts of different domains. So